Right. So, if I could tell like a biblical story, because we're going to get into kind of a new subject here. So this is kind of where we're going to go in the second class for the marriage part. When God created Adam and Eve, right, all the way in the garden, God puts Adam in the midst of the garden, and He blesses him with all these different plants, all these different, everything that he needed was there, right? But he would have had no way of knowing about how to. He wasn't a garden. I mean, he didn't come out of creation, with gardener in him. Somehow he had to learn these type of things. You understand what I'm saying? That God gave him blessings, but then yet there was a learning period where he had to learn how to manage the blessing, right? And I think sometimes that's how marriage is. That you can be blessed with somebody in your life, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily know how to manage that blessing from day one, right? And so there has to be in Adam a humbleness to say, okay, all this is new to me. I know it's a blessing. It's from the Lord. But how do I make this fruitful? What is my responsibility to make sure that this blessing stays healthy and fruitful? And that's a really good metaphor for marriage, that we get thrown into this, and it is a blessing. And that God does put people in our life that's a blessing. But you may not know how to do it the right way off day one, right? And so it takes a humble attitude that says, okay, I know this is a blessing. I know there's fruitfulness that can come out of this marriage. How do I do it, right? And that it begins with that attitude, right, of willingness, of wanting to learn, right? Because marriage doesn't just, it's not an instinct. It's really not. That there's a lot, because your instinct, your fleshly instinct, is generally selfish, right? Like most people, I mean, that's the fallen condition of humanity, is that we are selfish, and so we tend to see things through our own self-interest if we're not careful. And so it takes an undoing of that to genuinely walk in a loving marriage. So anyways, the idea is that Adam had all kinds of blessings around him, but there was still a season of learning how to manage the blessing that God had given him. And marriage is that way. It is a blessing. Your family is a blessing. But there is a season of learning how to manage that blessing so it remains fruitful, right? Okay. I was listening to, I remember Stephen Covey. He passed away, but he wrote a few books, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And so I have some DVDs from him, and he was telling a story, and it had nothing to do with marriage, but the principle applies. And basically he was doing some counseling with people, and the thesis of his counseling was, the moment that you think that the problem is out there, that thought is the problem, right? So it was a business-related thing. So he was saying the moment that you think that the problem with running your business and why your business isn't successful is something that other people are doing to your business, he says that thought is what's keeping you from being successful. It's not the people around you, it's the thought that it's the people around you that's keeping you from being successful. It applies to marriage as well. The moment that you think it's the other person in the marriage, it is often that thought that is keeping you from having a healthy marriage, right? Because as long as you are, and every marriage goes through this, so I won't ask you to raise your hands because I know that every marriage has gone through this at some point, where you have had the thought, if this person would just change, things would be a little better, right? And it becomes a frustration to expect someone to change, right? Because a lot of times they don't, right? Who you married is who you married. They grow and they adapt, but a lot of times the core things about who they are don't change, no matter how frustrated you are, right? And so what I want to lay the foundation of in this class is that it is essentially your willingness to change you that results in a healthy marriage, not your ability to learn principles to change them, right? So a lot of times when people come into a marriage class, their thought is, if I could get these principles, then I can change the other person. Because as soon as the other person changes, then things are going to get better in this marriage. And often it's that thought that keeps genuine growth from happening. Jesus says you can't look at the speck, in somebody else's eye, and ignore the plank in your own. Right? And I think part of what he means by that is you can only see so much in someone else, right? Whenever you have an encounter with somebody else, even if you catch them on a bad day, you're only seeing a speck of either the good or bad in them, because from the outside in, you only get a glimpse. You don't have access to their thought life, their motivations, why they do what you do. There's a lot of people that give because they want to feel better about not doing something else, and so they don't want to be the one to do the work, so they give instead. And so it may not be a good motivation. It may be a cop-out, to ease their conscience. You don't know what somebody's going on the inside of their mind. It may not be they're giving to be faithful to the Lord. It may be giving because their conscience is bothering them about not doing something. So you never know what somebody's motivation is. You can't judge by the outside. And so what Jesus is saying is when you look at somebody else, all you have access to is a speck. You only get to see a little bit of them. But you are well aware of your own faults, right? And you have full access to seeing what's going on the inside of you. So how could you ever, no matter what you see in somebody else, really be too judgmental and harsh on them, because you have full access to your own dilemmas and you are well aware that the issues you deal with in yourself are probably much more complicated and detailed than the little bit that you got a chance to see in somebody else. So anyways, that's a long way of saying that when we're looking at our marriages, if we're focused on the mistakes in the other person, it becomes this drawing in, this focus of, man, if they just weren't like this, or if they would just do that, things would be better. And it takes all of your focus off what you can do to actually change it, because you really don't have the ability to change them. The part that you have the ability to change is yourself. And if you're not focused on doing that, then the changes never happen. So one of the best things to do is to begin to figure out what is it in you that can be changed. And you'd be surprised that when you begin to change, it sets off a chain reaction of changes in them. That often the change you want to see in them is not held up by them. It's held up by a change that has to take place in you that begins to open up some other doors, right? And so if you are having that thought, that, man, if I could just get them to change, I would at least submit that you might want to think about the fact that that thought might be what's holding you up. That thought alone, that I have to get them to change, could be what's holding it up. Not to say that there's nothing wrong with them and that they don't need to change. It's to say that that is not the path. The path is not to sit back and try and change them, because they're probably sitting over there thinking the same thing about you. If I could get them to change, then everything would be fine, right? Because they have their own opinions of you and things that they wish that you would adjust, right? And so imagine if one of you did the adjusting, right? If somebody did the adjusting, then the other person would say, wow, they actually did change. And then that may set off some chain reactions in them, right? Because somebody's sitting back there saying, man, if they would just change, things would be better. And they're frustrated because they don't see the change, right? Just like you're frustrated because you don't see the change. There are some changes that they would like to see in you that they are also living with silent frustration because you have not embraced those changes, right? And so just as you have a dream of how perfect your marriage would be if the other person made some changes, the truth is they probably have a vision of how perfect their marriage would be if you made some changes, right? And that just as they are holding up some of your happiness, you may be withholding some of their happiness by not being willing to change too. So it begins with changing what you have access to. You don't have access to their insight. You do have access to yours. And if you begin by changing yours, often it results in changes in them. Not always. Sometimes you do everything you're supposed to do and it doesn't always work out. But this is where you start. is by making sure that the problem is not with me, right? And figuring out what I can do, right, to be the spouse that they are wanting, right? So take out a quick piece of paper, if you will. It's a simple exercise, and you may not be able to answer this now, which is fine. But at least I'll give you the question, and you can go home and think about it if you want. Because this really does, if you can answer it right, the challenge is answering it correctly, right? But if you can answer this correctly, then you can kind of step back and begin to think about what you can do to change. So here's the question.
Like a light bulb question?
No. No, this one's more about you. So it's not a trick question. It's just one that's really hard to answer honestly, right? Or to even be aware of enough to answer honestly. What is it like to be married to me? And that's where it all begins. If you can figure out what is it like to be in a relationship with me? Am I too critical? Am I too needy? Am I too easily frustrated? Am I too impatient? Do I raise my tone? Right? Do I set unrealistic expectations? Do I withhold my emotions? Do I expect the other person to be more perfect than I expect myself to be perfect? Do I give grace to my mistakes, but not to the people around me? Do I treat the people that at church or at work differently than I treat the people at home? You'd be surprised at the number of people that do that. They spend themselves emotionally in their social circles and then have nothing left for the family. And so you get a different person in one setting, and then just emotionally they don't have it to continue to be that person in the home. And then you get some people that are abusive, right? I mean, that's a real thing, you know? To be married to me means to get punched every once in a while, you know? Or to be married to me means you're always going to be financially shaky ground because I'm going to spend every time I get a chance, you know? If I see a new car, I'm going after it. If I see, you understand what I'm saying? And then so to be married to you is financially shaky ground, right? Because it may not be there. Or maybe it's the opposite, and you save and you never spend. So being with you is boring, right?
About a year and a half ago, Nestor was doing a study with Mr. Charles and a couple other men, and he actually asked us, he asked me, what is it that he would like him to change about himself, and then he asked, what can he do to make my life easier, and then he actually asked each kid, but he asked us not to answer him right away, to think about it, and come back, and it just started, like that spiral that you had, the spiral went in a different way.
Right.
It changed things. Because then I'm asking, what do you want me to change?
If you have an already pretty good marriage, then asking the other people is a safe and good process. Some marriages, if you ask the other person, or some relationships, if you ask the other person, you may not get as gratifying an answer as you would like. Some marriages, if you ask that, the person takes advantage, right? I mean, that's, you know, or sometimes it's hard to be honest. If you have a secret frustration that you've been holding for years and you haven't, to this point, been able to express it to them, then when they ask you, maybe you can't express it then either. I mean, there's a lot of people that hold on to stuff that they feel embarrassed to tell their spouse, that they, you know, that, man, I've been wishing that you would go work out, or I've been wishing that you would get a better job. And that's a thought that they hold on to, but that can be hard to express, right? So, in your case, it obviously had good value because you guys took it and ran with it in a positive way. But because of the fact that there can be unspoken things that maybe don't get said, that's why it's beneficial to start with yourself and say, what is it like to be married to me? And then work out from there, you know. But this can be, and it is good to ask what people want, just as long as you're aware that some of the innermost desires, maybe they don't have the courage to tell you.
At first it was really hard to answer, and that's why I think he told us to think about it. Mm-hmm. Because when he first asked me, you know, I wanted it to be, I mean, he was serious. It wasn't like, oh, I want you to pick up your clothes or something like that. You know, I wanted it to be something, and he wanted it to be something that would actually make a difference.
Right. And so, and you know, in some relationships are not at the level where they can communicate that openly yet. Maybe they've been in a fighting, you know, cycle. And when you've been in a fighting cycle, sometimes people are guarded and they're wounded, you know, from the fights. You know, because some people, they use words like weapons because they feel like they're not heard, and so they get loud and their words become weapons. And sometimes the spouse is verbally damaged from that, you know, and they hold on to things. You know, we all do it a little bit, where you get into an argument with somebody and you're replaying it in your head the next day. You know, you're still thinking about what they said. Man, I should have said this, or what, you know. Some people, those wounds don't leave, you know, and they hold on to that stuff. The stuff that you said to them in the heat of the moment, your heat of the moment is gone, and so you've moved on, but that doesn't mean that they have. They could be holding on to something you said, you know, in some time past, right? And so the communication doesn't always lead to a good solution. Sometimes it does. So the one thing, though, that is a good place to start, even if you are in a wounded relationship, is self-reflection. What is it that I can change about me that is going to make this marriage better, right? Because that's always the place to start. And it's very rarely the place that anybody starts. Unless somebody triggers that and gives you that thought, your almost always natural reaction is, if they were different, this marriage would be better. Right, and you say, and you have an entire list of things that you would change about them, right? Even if you don't say it, there's, you know, in your moments of frustration, you think about it. Very rarely do people have a list of things that they would like to see themselves contribute more consistently to their own marriage, right? And so it begins by asking yourself, what is it like to be married to me? Does it mean that I live with no encouragement? Because I never build you up, right? Does being married to me mean that you know, there's no excitement? You know, does being married to me mean you know, that you can't trust me because, you know, I did a few things, you know, and now you can't trust me? You know, what does it mean to be married to you? And they're not all negative. You know, some things that it means to be married to you are positive, right? And they're strengths. Most people are much more aware of their strengths than their negatives. So when they think about themselves, they're thinking about what they add to the marriage. When they think about the other person, they're thinking about what they take away from the marriage. You know, and that's just human nature. And so you have to fight against that because they're thinking the same way. They've accentuated in their own life. Well, the guys say, well, I've been going to work every day, you know, and the wife's saying, well, I've been here at the house doing stuff every day, you know, and they're both in their own mind now have built a big case for why they're not the problem. But the truth is, in a marriage, it's both people, right? And both people have strengths and both people have weaknesses. And so the real key to a happy marriage is it begins with that humility to say, okay, let me begin with me. I'm going to fix some things with me, and let me see what that does around me and see if the change I want to see in them is not held up because I haven't made the change in me, right? And if I could become the person they're looking for, maybe that would set them at ease to start becoming the person I'm looking for, right? Maybe their fear or frustration with me is keeping them from changing. right? And so if I could be the person they're looking for, it might free them from the frustration they're feeling and open the door for them to make the changes that you're looking for in them, right? Okay. How much time do we have? Not much. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else we want to throw out here. Let me just give you one other thought here. I have other stuff on this, but we'll pick it up next week. Distancers and pursuers. At any given time in a marriage, it could change depending on the situation, but for the most part, in every marriage, because these tend to attract to each other, one person is a distancer, one person is a pursuer. So a distancer is somebody that would rather not deal with it. They're more internal, just, they don't want to face it. The pursuer is we need to deal with this. Hold on, come here, we need to have a talk. We need to think about this. We need to get it out there. We need to deal with it. And so they are a pursuer because that is how they understand fixing the problem, is going after it to get it fixed. A distancer understands it by dealing with it by separating themselves from it and being more internal, more recluse. So if you are having issues and you are the pursuer, you have to balance yourself a little bit, because a distancer's natural reaction is to distance. And so if you become the thing, right, then their natural reaction is distance from you, right? So if you pursue too much on a distancer, somebody that's more naturally inclined to be private and to just, let me just handle my stuff internally, not necessarily real connected with their emotions, you pursue them too much, then they go into distance mode with you, right? And that is their natural reaction because they just can't handle it. And that's hard for a pursuer to understand because they can handle it and they would like to deal with it. Maybe they've had enough of the frustration. Maybe their own insecurity is driving them crazy. Maybe their own desire for a better marriage is causing them to be very driven to getting it fixed. Maybe they've been in a class like this and they're ready to go. They're showing up with questions. What is it like to be married to you? Here, answer this. Do you know what it's like to be married to you? And so we get into this. And so you have to be very careful. If you are in one of those relationships, which many people are, because these two tend to connect well, right? Maybe the distancer couldn't get away in time or something, and so they like the cheetah and the limp gazelle. Yeah. And so introvert and extrovert, a lot of times they tend to, not always, but a lot of times they can connect. And then sometimes, because of pain, right, if somebody does something to the other one or something like that, a person can become more intense with wanting to heal, because it's not just fixing the marriage, it's also fixing what pain I'm going with on the inside, right? So something's happened in the marriage, maybe trust or something, some kind of turmoil. And it's not always between the people. Sometimes, something happens in your family, right? A loved one dies, and so now you're dealing with pain, and it's causing arguments in the marriage, whatever it is. There's all kinds of reasons why people get something between them. And so it's not just that this person is an extrovert. Sometimes this person is just feeling so much pain on the inside that they are now motivated to get this fixed. Not just because they want to have a great marriage, but because they are experiencing pain of some sort that is motivating them to want to fix this. And so they become a pursuer. They are now highly motivated to get this thing right because they don't want to feel like this, right? They have to be careful that they do it with moderation and with gentleness if the other person is a distancer, because you don't want to become so consumed with fixing it that you push away the very person you're trying to connect with, right? So you do it with moderation, one step at a time, right? Okay, so that's good. This is the foundation, right? And as we come in, we'll do some other things. We'll talk about, apologies and I'll define it next week because some of you don't know, but it's a thing you do sometimes in marriage, and we'll get to vocab next week. But no, these are good things. This is the marriage part. We want to go through a few weeks laying the foundation of what does a godly marriage look like. A lot of today's was how do you fix one that you're not happy with, right? But that's not every situation, right? I mean, a big part of having a happy marriage is when everything is just kind of average, that you want to take it to a new level. And so it's not always that you're dealing with some kind of major frustration and you have to do like damage repair. Sometimes you're just not putting the attention into it for it to be great. And if you do that for too long, then you end up with some other major things later. And so sometimes we're bridging gaps when things have gone haywire. And sometimes we're saying, all right, let's pick this up a level so that we don't have to deal with a lackluster marriage and the fruit of that at some point down the road, right? Okay.